I had to solve that problem that very night. If I didn't find a woman soon, my father would end up forcing me to marry someone I didn't want. And people were already starting to suspect me, to suspect my silence, my refusals. All I needed was a solution. That was what I kept telling myself, until I saw her. If she could see herself through my eyes, then maybe she would understand why I admire her beauty in silence, why her presence steals the words from my lips, while filling my heart with everything it longs to say. Her existence feels deliberate, created with purpose, touched with care, shaped by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. You are not an accident. You are the reason I exist.
The darbuka quickened its rhythm, and the dancers spun between the tables like living flames. But Khan did not notice the music first. He saw her, Asena, far too beautiful for a place like that. At that moment, he still did not know that a single night in a wine house would lead him across deserts, that their path would wind through secrets, dangerous alliances, and choices powerful enough to reshape an entire kingdom. Nor that there would be moments when the two of them would stand dangerously close, too close to keep pretending it was all nothing more than a simple arrangement. Because before Ka'an understood who she truly was, before the council began watching their every step, before a crown was about to change heads, Asena had already done the most dangerous thing anyone could do in front of a future king. She turned his world upside down. Chapter 1. Khan ordered mead without removing his hood. The man behind the counter did not even look at his face. He grabbed a mug, dipped it into the barrel, and set it down on the wood with a dull thud, already turning away before the liquid inside had stopped sloshing. It was exactly what Khan needed that night, to be no one. A dark cloak in a dark corner, invisible among the roar of voices and the heavy smell of roasting meat coming from the back. He raised the mug to his lips and drank slowly. The mead was thick and overly sweet, the kind that lingered in the throat longer than it should. Around him, men competed to see who could tell the most convincing lie about battles they had probably never fought. A coarse laugh burst near the fireplace, followed by the clatter of mugs hitting wood in celebration of something he had no interest in discovering. The torches along the stone walls flickered every time the door opened, casting long shadows across faces flushed with heat and drink. Khan looked down into his mug. One problem would not leave his mind, and the mead was not going to solve it. It never did. Still, there was something about sitting in a place where no one knew who he was that brought a certain relief, even if only for a few hours, from the weight of being himself. No need to answer. No need to decide. None of that constant pressure of eyes waiting for him to say the right thing in the right way. The music changed. The rhythm of the darbuka on the small stage near the fireplace sped up, stronger, livelier. Conversation softened. Mugs paused in midair. The dancers entered. Colorful skirts whirled with every step, coins sewn into their waist scarves chiming with a bright metallic sound. Some men whistled. Others clapped their hands on the tables with the enthusiasm of those who had drunk enough to forget their shame, but not enough to lose their senses. Ka'an looked at the group without much interest. One of them had a softer face than the others. Sweet features, almost out of place in a tavern like that. He noticed it the same way one notices a pretty stone along the road without stopping to pick it up. Beautiful, yes. But no beauty in the world could pull him away from the thoughts that followed him that night like a faithful shadow. He returned to the mead. The group began circulating among the tables, as was customary. Coins were tossed into scarves. Hands reached for more than they should, and the women slipped away with the ease of those who had done this hundreds of times before. Khan listened more than he watched, his gaze lowered toward his mug. Then he heard a different sound. A fist slamming heavily onto wood. Not in celebration, but with the rough force of a stranger who believes everything within reach belongs to him. He looked up. Near the table, A large drunk with a yellowed beard was gripping the wrist of the dancer with the sweet face. His other hand clutched his mug, and even from that distance Khan could imagine the smell rising from him. She tried to pull her arm free carefully. The drunk did not let go. Then she spoke. "Take your hands off me." Her voice did not come out small. It came out clear, cutting through the noise of the hall. "Do you think I'm your mother?" The room froze. The drunk blinked, trying to understand what had just happened. She grabbed the mug from the table and dumped its entire contents over his head. The mead ran down his yellow beard, through his greasy hair, across the leather of his already stained clothes. He stood there dripping, wearing the expression of someone who had been struck by a shock his body still refused to accept. She pulled her hand free. Khan slowly lowered his mug onto the table. That he had not expected. It was not the strength of the reaction, not the spilled mead, not even the silence that had fallen over the entire hall. It was the contrast, that soft, almost delicate face, and from it came a voice that asked permission from no one. A woman made of quiet features, who, in half a second, became something none of the men in that room dared challenge. Khan watched her with a feeling he had not experienced in a long time. Curiosity. The hall exploded back into voices. Some laughed. Others complained. The drunk, his speech thick with mead, finally found his voice to shout something that vanished beneath the noise. "Who are you?" Khan wondered, not expecting an answer. The entrance to the winehouse had been carved into the pale rock of the mountains of Cappadocia in the kingdom of Valkyria. The stone, shaped by wind and time, formed natural arches that looked as if they had been carved by ancient hands. Inside, the ceiling was high and uneven, lit only by torchlight fixed to the walls. The stone still bore the marks of old excavations, as though generations had once lived there. Small openings let thin strands of moonlight slip inside, painting silver patches across the stone floor. Outside, the rock formations rose like natural towers beneath the star-filled sky. It was an ancient place. Khan had slipped out through the side door, before the voices grew louder than the flames, and now he leaned against the stone wall outside. The night air was cold and clean, carrying that scent of herbs and mountain wind that Cappadocia always held. Voices filtered through the closed door, muffled. The owner gestured angrily. She answered back, and neither of them seemed willing to give in. "Not for all the gold you will ever see would I let him touch me with those filthy hands." "You don't work here anymore. Leave." "I'm glad," she replied, and there was something in her voice that was not anger. It was dignity. "I'd rather sleep in the stables than serve a single cup to a man who doesn't wash." The door slammed. Khan straightened from the wall. She stepped down the 2 stone stairs with her shoulders held high, her eyes wet, but refusing to spill. Her hand clutched the fabric of her skirt, as if holding something inside herself that threatened to break free. The torchlight at the entrance reached only half her face, but it was enough to see she was fighting a silent battle with herself. Khan stood still for a moment. The thoughts in his mind had no clear shape. A delicate problem had remained unresolved for weeks, and a woman had just poured mead over a stranger's head, with the calm of someone simply correcting the world. He stepped after her. "Wait." She turned. Her eyes scanned him quickly from head to toe, assessing. "The tavern is back there," she said, pointing with her thumb. "I don't work there anymore, but I'm sure someone else will still serve you." "That's not it. I have a proposal for you." Something shifted across her face, not fear, recognition. The look of someone who had heard the words, "I have a proposal," come from men in places like that before. "You can keep it." She turned away. "It's not what you're thinking. Every man says that." She kept walking. Khan followed. There was something strange about chasing a stranger through a dark alley, while she ignored his presence with almost admirable dedication. She stopped. It was like stepping onto a stone you had not expected to find. Her body stopped before her mind did. Then she turned slowly, the expression of someone deciding whether what she had heard was real or just the cold night air playing tricks. "Go on then," she said, tapping her foot against the ground. "Before I regret stopping." Khan took a breath. He had not rehearsed any of this. He had planned nothing beyond ordering mead and returning home with the same weight he had left with. "I need a companion, not a real one." Before she could speak, he continued, "A marriage arrangement, just enough for those who need to see it." She stared at him. There was the silence of someone truly weighing things, not someone hesitating out of habit. "And what do I get besides being a piece in your game?" "A name. Gold. And a roof," he said. "Are you telling the truth?" She tilted her head, her eyes moving over his cloak, his boots, the mug in his hand. "Because you don't even look like you have money." Khan glanced at the mug and set it against the stone wall. "I'm not what I seem." "Of course you're not," she said, crossing her arms. Someone who proposes marriage before asking a person's name clearly doesn't think before acting. It was fair, fairer than he wanted to admit. With a simple gesture, Khan removed his hood. The moonlight was faint, but it was enough. Strong features. A presence that was not merely physical. The way he occupied space. Something that came from years of being obeyed. And around his neck, almost invisible in the dimness, a chain bearing the engraved symbol of Velkaria. "I am Prince and Alpha Khan," he said, "son of King Avar." A pause. "Of the kingdom you are standing in right now." She blinked. Once. Twice. Then she turned around and kept walking, faster than before. Khan watched her quicken her pace, and for the first time that night, felt something dangerously close to desperation rise in his chest. This was not going the way he had imagined. Not like this. He ran a hand through his hair and followed again. "Wait," he said, urgency now in his voice. "You haven't heard the rest." "I've heard enough," she replied without slowing down. "I won't accept any proposal, Your Highness." "Why not?" "Because princes who propose marriage to strangers in dark alleys either drank too much," she threw a quick glance over her shoulder, "or carry a problem I don't want anywhere near me." Khan walked faster until he reached her side. "Both are true," he admitted with a frankness even he had not planned. She slowed slightly. "My father wants to pass the crown." He did not soften the sentence. "He wants to rest. To live what remains of his life, without carrying the weight of every decision of the kingdom on his shoulders." He took a deep breath before continuing. "And for that to happen, he needs to be certain everything will remain in order when he is gone. That the heir is established. That there is a companion beside him." He paused. "Without that, there are nobles in this kingdom already counting the days until they take that place." She walked a few steps in silence, absorbing each word. "You have no one." It was not a question, just a statement. "No." "By choice?" He let out a tired breath. "I don't need love. I need an agreement." She stopped and studied him carefully, as if weighing the measure of a man before deciding whether to trust him. "Because if you've spent your entire life alone," she said slowly, "and suddenly appear proposing marriage to a dancer you've never seen before." She raised her eyes to his. "Then there are only two possibilities. Either you are desperate, or you are underestimating me." A second of silence. "And in both situations, the problem is yours, not mine. It had been years since anyone spoke to him like that, without fear, without reverence, as if he were simply a man, not a prince who had grown used to never being questioned. He answered carefully, "I'm not underestimating you. I'm offering something simple, a clear agreement. You give me the appearance the kingdom requires, and I give you something that does not depend on feelings." He held her gaze. "Just an agreement, only for as long as necessary." She tilted her head slightly, thoughtful. "No kissing?" The question came out blunt and practical. Better settle that now than discover later. He did not hesitate. "In public, enough to convince those who need convincing. And when it's just the two of us? No." She thought. What kind of prince made an agreement like that? Men like him were involved with women all the time. Either he was lying, or he did not like women, or that story hid something far worse. "And you don't enjoy that sort of thing?" She frowned slightly. "With women?" Khan's jaw tightened before he could stop it. "Are you going to accept or not?" She stopped walking entirely. She turned to him, arms crossed, head slightly tilted, the look of someone who had just realized something she should have noticed earlier. "Your Highness," she said calmly, though there were sharp edges beneath the tone. "You drank a lot of mead tonight, didn't you?" Khan frowned. "What does that have to do with—" "Everything," she interrupted naturally. "How can you propose marriage if you don't even know my name?" The silence that followed carried a different weight from the ones before. Khan stood still. For the first time, he had no answer ready. She was right. He had proposed marriage to a stranger without even asking her name. He had chased her through a dark alley, as if the simple fact that she existed were reason enough. "You're right," he said at last without hiding it. "My apologies for the lack of manners." A brief pause. Then, with a simplicity that was not smallness, but the honesty of someone who had finally found the right beginning. "What is your name?" She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a door opening just enough to let a thread of light pass through. "Asina." He looked directly at her then, without the earlier rigidity, without the urgency. "Do you accept the agreement?" She studied him for a long moment. Then she let out a soft breath through her nose. Not quite laughter, but close enough to be its cousin. "I accept," she said without drama, "only because I have nowhere to sleep, and the only other option is Mr. Farrak's stables, which smell worse than the drunk I soaked." She met his eyes. "We have an agreement." Khan looked at her. She looked back. Then Khan disappeared down the alley, his hood once again covering his head. Asina stood still for a moment, alone, staring at the empty space where he had been. What did I just do? It was not a question, just the truth settling in. She looked down at her right wrist. A faint pink mark remained where the drunk had grabbed her. She slowly closed her fingers. It was only an agreement. She would have a roof. She would have gold. She would have protection. He would have what he needed for his father to pass the crown in peace. It was sensible. It was reasonable. Asina turned and walked back toward her home, 2 streets above, past the market. "Reasonable," she repeated quietly. Chapter 2. Asina was sitting on the edge of the thin mattress with her hands resting in her lap when the knock came. She stood, wrapped the shawl over her shoulders, and went to the door. The man outside was tall, broad shoulders, strong features, and the kind of calm expression that comes from years of training not to reveal what he is thinking. He wore a hood. "Asena?" The voice was deep and direct. "My name is Taruk. I am the beta of Prince Khan of Velkaria." He gave a slight nod. The prince sent me to assist you with the move. I will take you to one of his houses so you may prepare for the presentation dinner tonight. The prince asked that you not worry about anything. Everything has already been arranged. Asina stood in the doorway for a moment and thought, so the agreement is real after all. Give me a moment, she said. She went to the chest in the corner and began folding the clothes she owned. You will not need those, ma'am. The beta's voice came from the doorway, respectful but firm. The prince has already provided everything you will need. Asina nodded and followed Taruk through the narrow streets away from the busy market, both of them hooded so no one would recognize them. The house leaned against the mountain rock, discreet, with a dark wooden door and thick walls that revealed nothing of the interior. He opened the door. Asina stepped inside. The chamber is there. Taruk gestured with his head toward the door at the back. You will find everything you need for tonight. A brief pause. The prince will come for you at sunset for dinner. He gave a respectful nod. With your permission. Then he left, closing the door carefully behind him. Asena looked. On the bed lay a dress. It was not the kind of garment she knew from the other dancers, patched together with creative stitching and fabric worn thin along the folds. This one was a deep blue that shifted tone in the light from the window, with golden embroidery worked along the neckline and sleeves, threads that looked as though they had been placed one by very patient hands. Beside it sat soft leather shoes, with delicate, precise straps. And resting carefully atop the folded fabric was a dark wooden case. She opened it. Inside was a slender golden necklace, elegant, with a dark stone set at its center, matching earrings that carried the weight only real metal has when held between the fingers. Asina stood there looking at it for a moment she could not measure. She had never touched anything like that, never even imagined she would. That kind of thing belonged to a world she had only ever observed from afar, through gates and tall windows, worn by women of noble blood who passed through the market streets with embroidered veils and servants trailing behind them. Khan arrived at sunset. The door opened, and Asina stood on the other side wearing the blue dress, the necklace at her throat, and the earrings swaying lightly with each movement. Her hair was pinned up with skill, something she had clearly learned to do herself. Khan stood still for a second. He had spent the entire day thinking about that dinner as a problem to solve, with the council, with his father, with Demir wandering through the castle corridors wearing his usual calculating smile. And now, standing before him, was a woman who the night before had worn a dancer's skirts in a tavern in Cappadocia, and who at that moment looked simply right where she belonged. As if the blue dress had not turned her into someone else, but had revealed a presence that had always been there. The dress suits you, he said. Asena looked down at the fabric, then back at him. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever worn, she replied with the same simplicity. In truth, it is the only beautiful thing I have ever worn. Kaan did not respond to that, but something shifted across his face for a fraction of a second before everything returned to its place. Come, he said, stepping back. We cannot arrive after the king. They crossed the Cappadocian desert, riding the same camel. Asina sat in front, with Kaan directly behind her. The slow sway of the camel made her body brush lightly against his with every step, and his closeness, the warmth, the scent of him, stirred something in her she would rather not admit. Asena remained silent. On the outside, she appeared calm. Inside was something entirely different. Dinner, in the castle, with the king. She had danced all her life. She had served mead to drunken merchants, dodging wandering hands with the ease of someone who learned such things early. But she had never entered a castle, never sat at a king's table, never needed to know what kind of bow to give, what tone of voice to use, how much distance to keep. Behind her, Khan kept his eyes forward, wearing the same closed expression as always, lost in thought. "How does one greet the king?" Asena asked. Khan tilted his head slightly so he could hear her better. "With a bow, head lowered, posture firm. You do not speak before he does." She nodded, repeating the instructions in her mind. "Anything else?" "Do not look directly into his eyes at first," he said after a pause. "And do not touch him." "Of course," she replied. The castle of Velkaria was carved directly into the living rock of the mountains, its towers rising upward like part of the stone itself, and its gates opening heavy and slow. When the camel finally passed through the gates and entered the inner courtyard, guards on either side straightened, and the torches along the walls cast an orange glow across the stone. Kaan dismounted first, and then helped Asena down. She stood there for a moment, looking up at the towers. It was the first time she had seen the castle up close. From the city, it looked like part of the mountain. From inside, it felt like an entirely different world. Khan stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly so the guards would not hear. "Yes." She kept her eyes on the stone walls. "I have simply never seen it like this." He watched her for a moment, the way her face lifted with a mixture of quiet wonder and determination, then turned toward the interior. "Come." The dining hall was so long that footsteps echoed. The table was long and made of dark wood, with tall candlesticks casting warm light across the faces seated there. At the head, in a chair larger than the others, sat King Avar. Asena saw him before she reached the table, and immediately understood where Kaan had inherited his features. The king's hair was white at the temples, and his face bore the marks of a man who had lived more than he had rested. But there was something in his eyes identical to his son's, the look of someone who weighs things carefully before speaking. Kayan stepped toward the head of the table. "Father," he said with a respect that was not ceremonial but genuine. "I need to introduce my companion. This is Asena." King Avar lifted his gaze, and then Asena felt the weight of that gaze settle on her. The silence of the entire room turned toward her. The faces of the counselors seated at the table, the servants along the walls, the warmth of the candles, the smell of meat and spices, the sound of her own steps suddenly seeming far too loud. "Bow. Head lowered. Do not speak first." She did. She lowered her chin and bent her knees slightly. When she straightened, the king was still looking at her. She leaned forward slightly and placed a gentle kiss on the king's forehead. The silence that fell over the room lasted no more than a second, but it felt like an eternity. Khan froze completely. "She is insane," was the only thought that crossed his mind with absolute clarity. Completely insane. "I brought a madwoman into my castle." The counselors exchanged glances. Someone near the window inhaled sharply. Taruk, leaning against the wall at the back, fixed his gaze on the ceiling with the careful expression of someone deciding that at this precise moment he had seen absolutely nothing. King Avar blinked once. Then the corners of his mouth moved slowly into a smile. It began small and grew gradually, almost ceremonially, until it reached his eyes. A quiet laugh escaped his chest, the first one Khan had heard from his father in weeks that had felt much longer than they were. "As far as I am concerned," the king said, his voice rough but clear, with the dry humor that appeared only when something genuinely surprised him, "they should marry tomorrow." A muffled laugh slipped from somewhere along the table. The nearest servant turned his face discreetly to hide a smile. Khan released the breath he had been holding without realizing it, rubbed a hand over his face briefly, and decided that this moment would never be mentioned aloud by him for the rest of his life. Asena straightened, her heart beating faster than she allowed to show, her cheeks slightly warm. He said not to touch him, she thought. He said exactly that. But the king had been smiling. For a moment, his face reminded her of her own father when she was a child. When he returned home, that was how she greeted him, with a kiss on the forehead. Nervous and carried away by the memory before she could think, Asena had simply repeated the gesture. Khan pulled out the chair beside his before any servant could move. Asena sat without comment, but she noticed the gesture. 2 seats below the king sat a man with his arms resting on the table, and a smile that was nothing like his uncle's. The king's smile carried warmth. His stayed on his face like something placed there deliberately. His eyes settled on her with an attention Asena recognized before she even knew his name. "Cousin," he said in a smooth, almost friendly voice. "I did not know you had become engaged." He tilted his head slightly. "Where have you been hiding this?" "Demir." Khan's voice came out short, leaving no room. "It is a simple question. I have never seen you with any woman, never seen you in any house of leisure, and suddenly you appear with a companion." A carefully measured pause. "It is surprising." "I met her during one of my travels," Khan said, adding nothing more. Demir smiled as though he believed none of it, but chose to save that thought for later. King Avar looked at his nephew with the calm of a man who had seen much and learned not to waste words. Then he returned his attention to the table, as if silently deciding the matter was closed. Dinner passed slowly. Asena ate carefully and observed everything. She saw the way those at the table looked at Khan, and the way they looked at her. She saw how Demir pretended not to watch while watching more than anyone. She saw how the king occasionally looked at his son with an expression that carried something close to pride. After dinner, when the others began drifting through the corridors, Khan called her aside in a quiet corner of the hall. "I will come to your chambers later." Asena looked at him. "For what?" "To show what needs to be shown. The council has eyes everywhere. If we spend the night under the same roof and nothing happens between us, questions will come." "To show that we are a couple," she said carefully, without rushing. "It is enough to hold my hand in front of them. A glance here, a touch there. You do not need to go to my room for that. You do not understand how things work here." "Perhaps not," she admitted without defensiveness. He did not respond. And he did not agree. In the chambers given to her, Asena was loosening the fastenings of her dress when footsteps sounded in the corridor. Then, low voices. Khan appeared in the doorway before she realized he had knocked. "There are 2 councilmen in the corridor," he said quietly, closing the door carefully behind him. "Taruk warned me. They are waiting for anything they can carry back tomorrow morning." Asena looked at the door, then at him. "Then we must give them something to carry." They stood still for a moment, thinking the exact same thing. Khan walked to the small table near the door and began pushing it against the wall, dragging it with deliberate force to create the kind of noise old wood makes when scraped across the floor. Outside, the murmur of voices stopped. Asena pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. That alone was enough. Khan slapped his palm against the tabletop, then again, in a rhythm that left no room for interpretation. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes sparkling, and let out a sound that was half scream and half badly disguised laughter. "Louder," he said without stopping. "I am trying not to laugh," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Laugh later." She filled her lungs, lifted her chin with almost ceremonial determination, and let out a sound that filled the entire room. Khan struck the table harder. She raised the volume. He shoved a chair against the wall. She let out a light cry, then bit her lip, trying to hold back the laughter that insisted on escaping. She tried, failed, and ended up shouting and laughing at the same time. The sound came out as something neither of them had planned, yet somehow it was perfect. Outside, hurried footsteps retreated down the corridor. They both stopped at the same moment. Silence. Khan stood beside the displaced table, his palm still resting on the wood, and looked at her. Asena leaned against the wall, her hand over her chest as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes wet from laughing, her hair slightly out of place. And then they both burst into laughter at the same time. He laughed with the surprise of someone who had not expected any of this to happen, and there was something new in that laughter, in the way it softened the hard lines of his face and reached all the way to his eyes. Khan fell backward onto the bed with his arms open, the last traces of laughter still on his face as he stared at the ceiling. Then he turned his head and tapped lightly on the empty space beside him, calling her without words. Asena went. She lay down on the other side with her arms crossed, and the two of them stared up at the same ceiling. Chapter 3. They stayed like that for a reasonable while. Why don't you find someone for real? Asena's voice was low, without judgment. It was the honest question of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. With all of this, with all of Valkyria, there would be no shortage of women willing. Khan remained quiet for a moment. I never had the time, he said at last. And this time there was no resistance in the words. Perhaps because it was night, the room was dark, and something about that moment made certain things easier to say. My whole life was battle. One expedition after another. Doing what my father ordered, when he ordered it, the way he ordered it. There was no space for anything else. Asena stayed silent, letting the words settle. So you never truly met anyone, she said slowly. No. She tilted her face slightly toward the ceiling, thinking, that's why you're still a virgin. The silence that followed had a completely different texture from the others. Khan slowly turned his head toward her with the expression of someone deciding whether what he had heard was real. What makes you believe that? You proposed marriage without even considering a kiss. She kept looking at the ceiling, calm. Not that I wanted one, but it's a strange attitude for someone who knows women. A pause. And you haven't tried anything since I arrived. Not a hand lingering too long, not a look, nothing. That is called respect. Yes, it is, she agreed naturally. But it can also be called something else. Khan stayed quiet. Asena turned her face toward him. Her eyes were direct, without mischief, with that frankness that did not ask permission to exist. It would not be a problem, you know, she said, if you preferred the same sex. She spoke with the ease of someone discussing the weather outside. I would stay married for as long as necessary. No one would need to know. It would simply be another part of the agreement. The room went completely still. Khan remained frozen for a second that felt longer than it was. Then he stood up from the bed in one swift movement, without saying a word, crossed the room with steps that were far from slow, and the door slammed behind him with a firmness that made the candle flames bend all at once. Asena remained lying there staring at the ceiling. She knew she had gone too far with her words, that she had said something she probably should not have, but she had only been honest. Breakfast in the castle of Valkyria was served in a smaller hall than the dining chamber, with a table that seated 8, and that morning was occupied by 3. King Avar at the head, Khan on his right, and Demir across from him with the smile of someone who had slept well and woken with plans. Khan cut his bread in silence. Sleep well, cousin? Demir raised his mug to his lips without taking his eyes off Khan. The corridor seemed rather lively last night. Khan did not lift his gaze from the bread. Unnecessary remark. It was not a remark. It was a question. Demir opened his hands in a gesture of innocence. The entire castle heard it. I believe even the stones of the walls heard it. King Avar, who until that moment had pretended to be deeply interested in the contents of his own mug, let out a low sound that was unmistakably the beginning of a suppressed laugh. Father, Ka'an said without lifting his gaze, I said nothing. The king raised his mug to his lips. You did not need to. But Khan, that is not shameful, the king said simply. Among our kind, it is an honor. Khan did not answer. He continued staring at the bread on his plate. Among the shifters of that region, the matter was seen differently from human customs. While many human families valued waiting until marriage, among wolves, especially alphas, betas, and members of the royal guard, testing compatibility with potential companions was natural. It was not indulgence, but tradition, to find a partner with whom there was genuine connection and who could produce strong descendants capable of preserving a powerful lineage. Demir opened his mouth to continue, but at that moment the three of them heard footsteps on the staircase. Familiar footsteps, with a new detail. Uneven. Khan lifted his eyes. Asina descended the main staircase wearing a morning dress and her hair loose, her face well rested, and a polite smile on her lips. And limping. Not dramatically, not with theatrical exaggeration, but with the consistent caution of someone clearly favoring the right side of her body with every step. Khan stood from his chair before realizing he had done so. He crossed the room in a single stride and reached her before she touched the final step. What happened? He asked in a low voice, his eyes moving over the leg she was clearly protecting. Asena reached his side, adjusted her skirt with one hand, and inclined her head slightly with a calm smile. To add credibility to last night, she whispered softly enough that only he could hear. Khan stood completely still. She walked past him toward the table with her usual calm, greeted the king with a respectful nod, and pulled out her own chair before anyone else could move. Good morning, she said to them all. King Avar looked at her. Then his gaze moved to his son, standing in the middle of the room with an expression that clearly did not know what to do. Then he looked back at Asina again. This time with approval he made no attempt to hide. Demir observed the two of them, and his smile was beginning to shift into something harder to define. The days that followed began taking a direction Asina had not expected. There was no exact routine, no declared obligations. The castle received her with careful neutrality. Servants who did what needed to be done without questions. Chambers already prepared with everything she might need before she even realized she needed it. She divided her time between her room, where she read whatever she found on the shelves, and the inner garden where the mountain air passed through the stones of Velkaria. It was in the garden that she saw him most often. Not intentionally. But Khan crossed that space frequently on his way somewhere, always with Taruk behind him, and messages in hand. He rarely stopped or looked around. Yet whenever he passed near her, something shifted. A slight slowing of his pace. A glance that came, rested for a second, then moved on. And when they were in public, when counselors or servants were nearby, he placed his hand on the small of her back with such natural ease that it took Asena 2 days to realize. His hand remained a second longer than necessary to convince anyone watching. It is only the agreement, she told herself. That afternoon, Asena stood in the main corridor speaking with one of the servants about the herbs in the garden when she heard voices from the adjacent room. The door was slightly open, and she recognized Khan's voice before she even looked. He was discussing something with 2 counselors, leaning over a table with the posture of someone in the middle of a decision that could not wait. His voice was steady, his gestures measured, and there was that quiet authority he carried without needing to declare it. Asena turned her attention back to the servant, but the atmosphere inside the room shifted. The counselors continued speaking, their words flowing at the same pace as before. Yet Khan had stopped answering, and when she lifted her eyes, almost without meaning to, she saw that he was looking at her through the half-open door. There was a change in that expression, something she could not name. Before she could understand what it was, he turned his gaze back to the counselors and resumed the conversation as though nothing had happened. Asina's heart beat in a way that had no reasonable explanation. She returned to speaking with the servant, though her attention was no longer entirely there. That same night, at the smaller dinner served in the castle for those currently in residence, Demir appeared at the end of the meal with the step of someone who had not been invited and did not care. He sat at the table without ceremony, took a glass of wine, and looked at Kaan with the smile of someone saving an observation for the right moment. "Cousin," he said at last in a tone far too smooth to be innocent. "I noticed something today." Kaan did not lift his eyes from his plate. "How fortunate for you. I have never seen you like this." Demir tilted his head slightly, his gaze moving from Kaan to Asina and back again, stopping in the middle of a sentence just to look at her. A calculated pause. "I did not know you were capable of that, cousin." Kaan set the knife down on the table with a calmness that carried more tension than any sudden gesture. Asina remained quiet, her eyes on her plate. "Do you have anything relevant to discuss, Demir?" Kaan said in a low, direct voice. "Because if you do not, dinner is finished." "Only an observation." Demir raised his glass. "From someone looking in from the outside?" "Then look from the outside with your mouth closed." Demir smiled and drank his wine, satisfied with something. Asina did not raise her eyes from the table for a long time. When dinner ended and the guests began drifting through the castle corridors, she left before anyone could attempt conversation. The castle library was on the second floor, with a wide window overlooking the towers and shelves that climbed higher than the torchlight could fully reach. Asina had discovered the place by accident while searching for a corridor that would lead back to the garden. She had stayed because something about the old books and the smell of ancient paper made silence feel comfortable. She sat near the window with a book open on her lap when she heard the door. Kaan entered without realizing she was there. He went straight to the shelves at the back with his usual stride, direct, purposeful, without hesitation. There was a different lightness in him there. No Taruk behind him, no counselors, no dining hall and its games of words. His shoulders were less rigid, his jaw less tense. Asina stayed quiet. He took a book from the shelf, flipped through a few pages, and walked to the large table at the center of the room without noticing someone sat near the window. He stood there reading in silence. Asina returned to her own book. The words stopped making sense, not because the book was poor, but because the silence in that room had a different quality. It was the silence of two people who had learned to exist in the same space without needing to justify their presence. She lifted her eyes from the page and met his. That was when he realized she was there. He stood with his eyes fixed on hers over the open book in his hand, wearing an expression she could not classify quickly enough before he looked back down at the pages. Asina lowered her gaze as well. Her heart was racing. She looked up again. He was looking at her. This time neither of them looked away. Heat rose to Asina's cheeks before she could do anything about it. Across the table, Kaan closed the book firmly. His jaw was slightly tense, his fingers tight on the leather spine, and there was that specific rigidity in his expression that belonged to someone fighting an internal battle he had no intention of admitting aloud. "I did not know you were here," he said. "I was not expecting company," she replied softly, disguising the nervousness he had surely already heard in the quick rhythm of her heartbeat. He nodded once, placed the book on the table, and left with steps slightly faster than necessary. The door closed behind him with a quiet sound. Asina remained in the chair with the open book on her lap, warmth still lingering in her cheeks. "It is all in my head," she decided, with the firmness of someone not entirely convinced. She returned to the book, but could not read another word. The dinner with the council was scheduled for a few days after Asina's arrival at the castle. Kaan passed her in the corridor before nightfall and stopped. "Tonight will be different," he said in the low voice he used when he did not want the corridor listening. "Stay close to me." If someone says something you do not know how to answer, do not answer. Leave it to me. She looked at him. Should I be afraid? He remained quiet for a second. No, he said at last, but you must be prepared. The dining table was full that night. The 8 counselors occupied the sides, King Avar at the head, Khan at his right with Asena beside him. Demir sat at the far end. Food was served, wine circulated, conversations filled the room. Asena ate carefully and observed everything. She saw how the counselors looked at her sideways, weighing every movement she made, exchanging brief glances with one another with the silent language of people who share the same thought without needing words. She had finished half her plate when Demir set his glass down slowly. Asena. Her name came out with studied ease. I have been trying to remember since you arrived. He tilted his head, his eyes fixed on her with an attention that was not admiration. I have the impression I have seen you somewhere before. The air inside Asena's chest stopped. She did not answer. Demir continued. Cappadocia, perhaps. He pretended to think. There was a tavern I used to visit when passing through. I remember faces like that. A pause. Faces that stay with you. Demir. Khan's voice was low, the kind of low that is more dangerous than a shout. It is only an observation, cousin. Demir opened his hands. There is nothing wrong with recognizing someone. There is when the intention behind it is to poison what you say. Intention? Demir made a sound that was not quite laughter. I only care about the kingdom. The council has the right to know who will sit beside the future king. A woman without a name, without known lineage, without any alliance to offer Velkaria. One more word. Khan stood. Something in the way he did it made at least 2 counselors lean back in their chairs without realizing. One more single word about her in that tone, he said, and I swear the only place you will visit in the coming months is the dungeon. You threaten a member of the royal family because of a... I am stating a fact, Khan cut in, his voice cold as stone. There is a difference. If you cannot understand it, the problem is you, Demir, not her. Demir remained still, the smile still on his face, as though it had not yet received the order to disappear. His eyes moved to Asena for a second, calculating, before returning to his cousin. Will the king allow that? He asked, turning toward the head of the table with a deference that was anything but genuine. King Avar, who had watched everything with his gaze moving between the two of them with the calm of a man who had seen much, placed his glass down with a soft but decisive sound. If you open your mouth at this table again to insult someone I welcomed into my home, he said, his voice rough but absolutely firm, you will know the stones of the dungeon before sunrise. Demir stood still for a second. Then he rose slowly, with a composure that cost more than it appeared. He left the room. His chair fell behind him. No one mentioned it. King Avar remained unusually quiet in the minutes that followed. Asena noticed before Khan did. The way the king placed his palm flat on the table, too slowly, the shift in his shoulders, the shortening of his breath. Khan, she said softly, but it was too late. The king pressed a hand to his chest at that moment, wearing an expression that was not yet pain, but its warning. Ka'an stood before any servant could move. The healer, he said to Taruk, who was already rising. Now. The counselors stepped back. Ka'an went to his father and carefully placed an arm behind his back. They carried the king to his chambers. The healer arrived, a woman with steady hands and a calm voice who asked for space to work. Ka'an and Asena remained outside the closed door. The corridor was silent. Ka'an stood with his back against the cold stone, arms crossed over his chest, staring at the door with a serious and deeply worried expression. Asena stayed beside him without speaking. The silence stretched. Then Ka'an's shoulders dropped. A small, inevitable movement of someone finally letting go of the weight he had been carrying. That moment when the body decides it can no longer pretend. He lowered his head, and a sound left his chest. Low, contained. Then, without warning, without asking, without saying a word, his arms went around her. Asina stiffened. Not out of fear, out of surprise. She stayed there with her arms trapped at her sides, shoulders tense, while his face lowered until it found her shoulder. His breathing changed. Asena remained still for another second. Then slowly her arms moved around his broad back, and she stayed there, steady, her hands open against his back, feeling the weight of that man trusting her without asking permission. There was nothing to say. They simply remained there. This is it, she thought, not quite knowing what she meant. This is the place. It was the safest place she had ever been. The door opened. Khan straightened before the healer had fully appeared in the doorway. Asena stepped back, giving space for what needed to be said. The king is stable, the woman said. The pain has passed, but he needs rest. Khan nodded. The healer went back inside. He stood in the corridor for a moment, his eyes fixed on the closed door, his composure already restored. If not for those few seconds that had just happened, anyone passing by would see only the Prince of Valkyria worried about his father's health. But Asena had seen what lay beneath. Khan turned toward her. "Thank you," he said quietly. They walked through the corridor in silence until she reached the door to her chamber. Asena pushed it open and stepped inside. When she turned, Khan was already walking away, as if the entire night had not happened, as if carrying everything alone was the only way he knew how to exist. She looked at his back. At the cut on his forearm, he continued to ignore. At the shoulders that remained rigid, even after everything that had collapsed in that dark corridor. Before she thought, her hand had already moved. Her fingers closed around his wrist. Khan stopped. He stood still for a second, without turning. Beneath her fingers, his pulse beat strong, more alive than it should for a man simply standing still. "Stay," she said. Simple. Direct. He turned slowly. Her eyes met his, and that same thing that had filled the corridor moments earlier was still there, too large to fit inside a single word. She stepped backward into the room without releasing his wrist. He stepped inside. They stood in the center of the room looking at each other while the torch cast a low glow over the stone walls. "Is it a problem for you if I sleep here?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on hers. Asena looked at him with the calm she always had when she felt more certain than she appeared. "None at all," she said. "I know I am not in danger." A short pause. The corner of her mouth moved with that lightness he had already learned to recognize as the beginning of an inevitable provocation. "You have never tried anything since I arrived." She lifted her shoulders slightly, as though stating a simple fact. "You do not pose a risk." The room fell completely silent. Khan stood still for a second, that lasted longer than it should have. Then the air left his nose in a way that was not quite a sigh. It was the sound of someone deciding he had reached the limit of restraint that had lasted far too long. He stepped forward. His hand went to her waist without hesitation, without the careful gentleness of the previous days, with firm certainty, pulling her against him in a movement that left no distance between their bodies. Asena barely had time to breathe. The kiss came without warning and without restraint, deep and complete. She felt her legs lose the strength they had a moment before, her fingers automatically clutching at his chest because they needed something to hold, while the ground beneath her seemed to vanish. When he pulled back, it was only enough to speak. "Never again," he said, his voice rough and low, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Never again play games with me." Asena stood there with parted lips, trying to recover her breath, completely still. her fingers still gripping the fabric of his clothing. "I am tired," he continued without releasing her waist, his voice coming from somewhere deep she had not known before. "Tired of every time you pass by me, and I pretend I feel nothing. Tired of sleeping under the same roof and waking with your scent everywhere, pretending it does not affect me." His fingers tightened slightly. "Of course I like women. Of course I like your scent. And of course I have been holding myself back since that damned wine house. Or did you think I asked you to be my wife simply because you are beautiful and know how to dance?" Asena stood completely still, looking at him with eyes that had not yet returned to their normal size. Khan continued, "I am going mad over your scent." Khan did not wait for an answer. The hand at her waist slid to her back and pulled her close again without ceremony. The second kiss came stronger, deeper, longer, with the overwhelming force of someone who was no longer trying to restrain himself. She gave in completely. There was no better word for it. Her knees weakened. Her arms rose around his neck by instinct alone, and she answered with everything inside her, with 7 weeks of stolen glances and thoughts she had insisted to herself were only imagination. Ka'an lifted her the way he did everything, with that direct, steady strength of someone who had never needed to prove anything. Her legs wrapped naturally around him, while he held her against his chest, one hand firm at her waist and the other lower, holding her securely. In a few strides he crossed the room and laid her on the bed, which received the weight of both of them in a single movement. The fabric of the dress gave way beneath his hands with a brief final sound, a sound she did not have time to register before the heat of his skin reached her. And then there were no more clothes, no more distance, no agreement at all. There was only that. The two of them, on that bed within the ancient stone walls of Cappadocia, with torchlight trembling across the walls, and the whole world outside ceasing to matter. He was far too intense, as if nothing else in the world deserved his attention but her. In every touch there was a focus that said more than any words he had ever spoken. His hands were large and calloused, marked by years of battle, and Asena felt immediately the roughness of his skin against hers. And still, there was care in that touch, an unexpected mix of intensity and attention, as if he were discovering every part of her with silent concentration, at once firm and surprisingly gentle. When he finally looked at her up close, with those fierce eyes, she knew, with the simple clarity of true things, that this was not only about the body, it was everything. Morning light slipped through the crack in the window before she even opened her eyes. Asena woke slowly, with that hazy awareness of someone rising from very deep sleep. The first thing she noticed was the warmth around her. Khan's arms were wrapped around her from behind. His broad, warm chest was pressed to her back. His breathing was slow and even, the calm rhythm of someone still asleep. She stayed still, eyes open, fixed on the cold stone wall, feeling every detail of that reality. The weight of his arm across her waist, the heat of his skin against hers, the way he slept wrapped around her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then he moved. A slow, deliberate adjustment, his arms tightening slightly around her before he spoke, as if he needed to make sure it was real before saying anything. "That was the best night I could have had." His voice came out rough and low, still warmed by sleep, and the words fell straight against her ear. Asena stayed quiet, eyes open, feeling every word. His lips brushed her neck with a softness completely different from the night before. There was no urgency, only presence. She said nothing. She remained there, still, letting it happen. Ka'an stayed like that for a while. Then his breathing changed. "I need to get up," he said, his voice still low, but with that firmness slowly returning, responsibility taking the place of rest. "There is a problem in one of the nearby villages. I need to deal with it before it gets worse." Asena nodded silently. "I will be back tonight." She nodded again. He slowly loosened his arms from around her, and the absence of his warmth came immediately. Asena heard him moving behind her and decided she was not going to turn around. She stayed that way for about 3 seconds. Then she turned. Khan had his back to her, standing, looking for his clothes around the room, with the natural ease of someone who had no idea what he was doing to the person still lying in bed watching him. The morning light fell fully across his back, tracing the long line of his spine. The shoulders she had learned the night before were exactly as broad as they looked beneath his clothes, the old scars telling stories she did not yet fully know. I am completely in love with him now. The thought arrived without warning and without ceremony. When he turned to leave, their eyes met. Khan stopped for a second. A different expression appeared on her face, and he noticed it at once, because a similar change crossed his face too, and she recognized it just as quickly. The two of them stayed that way for a moment, one too honest for either of them to comment on. Then he left. The door closed gently, and Asena was left alone with the morning light and a thought she could no longer deny. The day passed quickly. The note was on the bed when she returned to her chambers at the end of the afternoon. Come to the stable. We need to talk before dinner. Khan Asena read it twice, smiling before she could stop herself. She folded the note and went. At that hour, the castle was in motion, servants crossing the corridors with trays and firewood, guards changing posts with heavy footsteps on the stone. She went down the side staircase and stepped through the small courtyard that led to the stables. The door was slightly open. She pushed it and stopped. It was not Khan waiting inside. Demir stood in the middle of the stable with his arms crossed, and that smile she had already come to recognize as something bad. Behind him stood 2 men she did not know, with the bearing of neither servants nor guards. Asena's heart dropped. Do not be afraid, Demir said, in that smooth voice more threatening than any shout. We just need to talk. I have nothing to say to you. She took a step back toward the door. One of the men closed it before she could reach it. What a shame. Demir took a step toward her with the calm of someone in no hurry, because he already knows the outcome. Because I have quite a lot to say to you. His eyes moved over her from head to toe with a contempt he did not bother hiding. A tavern dancer. That is what you are. And to think you could ever sit on the throne as Queen of Velkaria is the most absurd thing I have heard in this castle. What do you want? She asked, keeping her voice firm despite the tightness in her chest. The same thing I have always wanted. Demir stopped a few paces away from her. This kingdom. He paused briefly. And you are in the way. Asena looked at the closed door, at the 2 men, at Demir standing in front of her. Shift. The thought came fast, instinctive. Her body was already reaching for the change beneath her skin, bones ready to give way, the wolf pushing forward. But before she could complete the transformation, one of the men came up behind her with a cloth in his hand, and the smell that hit her was sweet and heavy. The stable spun, and then there was nothing. Khan was in the corridor when Taruk appeared. From the beta's expression, Khan knew before he even spoke that the news was bad. Say it, Khan said. One of the loyal guards overheard 2 of Demir's men talking near the stables. Taruk kept his voice low, his eyes sweeping the corridor before continuing. The plan is to lure her there, use her as bait. When the prince goes after her, both of you will be killed. A pause. Demir wants the throne. The air in the corridor went still. Khan stood completely motionless for a second. Where is she? He asked, his voice coming from somewhere deep and quiet that was not calm. He took her. Taruk flicked a glance toward the window. Khan was already running before the sentence was finished. The stable was dark when he arrived. He shoved the door with such force that the wood tore from its frame, and what he saw inside made something in him snap loose. Asena was lying unconscious on the straw, her wrists bound, her hair spread around her face. Demir's 2 men stood near her and turned toward the door with the posture of men who had been expecting exactly this. Demir stood farther back, without the smile this time. "Cousin," he said, punctual as always. Khan stepped inside. What happened in the next seconds was neither slow nor orderly. One of the men lunged first, but before Khan could react, the other opened his hand and blew a fine powder into the air. The smell came first, bitter, herbal, verbena. Khan recognized it immediately. The effect came too fast. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet, the air turning heavy in his lungs. His body still obeyed him, but more slowly than it should have. He took a step forward, trying to keep his balance. Demir noticed at once. His smile appeared for a second. Then the shift came. Bones cracked and reformed, the human body giving way to a pale, broad wolf that emerged in the middle of the stable. The beast lunged without hesitation. Khan tried to react, but the verbena burned through his veins like cold fire. The blow hit him before he could avoid it. Claws ripped across his shoulder, and the air left his chest in a hard impact. He fell to his knees in the straw. He was still in human form, too weakened to shift. That was when another sound tore through the stable. A growl. Tarek was already shifted before he even crossed the doorway. The great dark wolf entered like a living shadow, and in the same instant realized 2 things. His alpha was injured, and he lost all reason when he saw Asena. Behind him came 2 more wolves from the royal guard. Demir took a step back. The 2 guard wolves ran to Khan first. Carefully, but without wasting a second, they grabbed him by his clothing and dragged him out of the stable, away from the verbena powder still hanging in the air. The cold night air hit Khan's face. He took a deep breath, then another. His head was still spinning, but his strength began returning far too fast for someone who had just collapsed. Inside the stable, Tarek was already fighting. Demir was not alone. The 2 men with him had also shifted. 3 wolves now circling in attack. Tarek kept all 3 occupied, moving too fast for them to box him in. That was when Ka'an rose. The shift came like thunder held inside. The great black wolf appeared where the man had been, larger than any other wolf in the stable. Its dark fur seemed to swallow the torchlight, while golden eyes locked onto Demir. His cousin realized his mistake too late. Ka'an lunged. The impact of their bodies smashed through one of the wooden stalls, sending straw flying across the floor. The black wolf's jaws clamped onto Demir's shoulder with enough force to wrench a growl of pain from him. Tarek was still fighting the other 2 wolves, keeping them back. But the main fight was already over. Khan pinned Demir to the ground with the full weight of his body. The black wolf's jaws stopped a fraction from his cousin's throat. Demir stopped moving. The scent of surrender came first. The other 2 wolves backed off right after. The stable fell silent. The heavy breathing of wolves filled the air. The change back came slowly. The great black wolf shrank until Khan returned to human form, his chest still rising hard with breath. Tarek and the other 2 wolves did the same, returning to their human bodies among the scattered straw. Moments later, guards rushed into the stable carrying blankets. Khan took one without saying a word and threw it over Demir, who was still on the ground. "Get up," he said, his voice low and hard. Demir slowly lifted his face. "Are you stupid?" Khan continued, eyes cold. "How did you think you could do this in my father's house? How did you think you were going to win? Or are you such an idiot that you could not come up with a better plan?" Demir let out a rough little laugh as he stood, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. "I am not going to tell you my plans," he said, "but your father is already weakened. It is only a matter of time." Khan stepped forward. "How dare you?" His voice came out low, but heavy enough to make 2 guards stiffen. He did not take his eyes off his cousin. "Take them all to the dungeon," he ordered, "until I decide what to do with them." The guards seized the prisoners. "You cannot do this to me," Demir protested as he was dragged out of the stable. But Khan had already turned away and was already kneeling on the ground beside Asena. She woke to the smell of straw and the stable ceiling above her. For a second, she did not know where she was. Then she did, and tried to get up too quickly, and the room spun. Slowly. Khan's voice came from very close by. She turned her head. He was beside her, kneeling. His eyes moved across her face with worry and focus. "Demir?" she asked. "In the dungeon." Asena nodded slowly. Her head still felt heavy from the effect of the verbena powder on the cloth. "The cut," she said, looking at his forearm. "It is nothing." "Khan." He stayed quiet. "It is nothing," he repeated, but this time without the same hurry as before. She looked at him for a moment. Then he leaned down and gathered her into his arms before she could protest. Asena felt the ground vanish beneath her feet as he lifted her easily, holding her firmly against his chest. He carried her back to the castle in silence. "Khan, I can walk already," she said, trying to sound serious. "Even so," he replied, without slowing his pace. She rested her head against his shoulder for a moment as they crossed the silent corridor of the castle. "Where exactly do you think you are taking me?" "To the bath," he said simply. Asena lifted her head. "You are going to bathe me?" Khan threw her a brief glance. "We are going to bathe." She wrinkled her nose. "You smell like horse shit." He said it with a small laugh. "And I am covered in blood." "I do not need that," she muttered. He pushed open the chamber door with his shoulder and entered. "Maybe not," he said as he gently set her down. "But I am dying to bathe you." The hot water slowly filled the stone tub. Khan helped her in first, with a quiet attentiveness that stood in sharp contrast to all the brutality of the fight only minutes earlier. His hands, now clean of blood, moved over her skin with care as he poured water over her shoulders. Asena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the heat of the water and his touch make the rest of the world disappear. When they stepped out of the bath, the room was warm and quiet. Asena put on the simple dress that had been left draped over the chair. As she adjusted the fabric over her shoulders, she turned to say something, and stopped. Khan was on his knees. In his hands was a ring. The dark stone at its center caught the candlelight like a small piece of the night. "Will you marry me?" he asked. Asena went completely still. Then a small laugh escaped her, along with a tear she could not stop. "But we are going to marry," she said, still trying to understand. Khan shook his head. "Before, it was an agreement," he answered. "Now I am asking for real." He lifted the hand holding the ring slightly. "Will you marry me?" Asena brought a hand to her mouth for a moment, her eyes shining. "I will," she said softly. "I truly want to spend the rest of my life with you." Khan slipped the ring onto her finger, stood, and pulled her into a kiss. Chapter 4. Khan found his father in the smaller chamber beside the royal quarters. The king was seated, his face turned toward the morning light. Khan closed the door behind him. "Father." The king turned his face toward him without surprise, as if he had known that visit had been on its way for some time. "Father, I need to confess something." The king raised his eyes to him. "Tell me something I don't already know." Khan let out a small, humorless laugh. "You already knew?" "My son," the king said, lifting the cup to his lips. "Everyone knows she is a dancer." Khan lowered his head for a moment, thinking. "It is not only that. I made an agreement with her." The king laughed again, louder this time. "Khan, tell me something I don't already know." Khan stood still with no answer. The king watched him more calmly. "You know, my son, everything I have ever demanded of you was because I want you to be a great king. But a fool is the one who believes a king rules alone. It is impossible for one person to carry an entire kingdom on his back." He took a slow breath before continuing. "When your mother died, everything became too heavy for me. A piece of my soul went with her, and I never wanted you to have to carry that weight alone." Khan remained silent. "I demanded loyalty from you, and you gave it to me. I demanded that you become a warrior, and you gave me that too. I demanded that you become a great politician, one of those men who speak well and persuade others." The king let out a laugh that almost turned into a full chuckle. "And you are very good at that, Khan." Khan raised his eyes. "I demanded so much from you that when the time came for you to choose your companion, that was the one thing you still owed me. You dismissed one, dismissed another, rejected every woman we brought before you." The king tilted his head slightly, until Asena appeared. He smiled. "What an extraordinary girl." Khan looked at him with an expression that was both confused and proud. The king continued, "I only find it curious that you found her in exactly the same place where I found your mother." Khan lifted his head suddenly. "What?" The king chuckled softly. "I never told you that, did I? It seems we kept that secret better than the two of you did." He shook his head with a calm smile. "But do you know something, Khan?" the king said at last. "You are fortunate. You will have a beautiful woman beside you, a woman who loves you and truly wants to see you well." He fell silent for a moment, watching his son. "But look at that," he continued with a small smile. "I asked you to tell me something I did not know, and you could not. However, there is something I know that perhaps you still do not." Khan frowned slightly. "Asena is not merely a dancer." The king leaned forward a little. "She inherited something that was lost over time. Perhaps even she does not know it. But a king must study many things about the origins of peoples, and it seems you have not reached that part yet." Khan looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" The king smiled faintly. "Do you know what her name means?" Khan did not answer. "Asena," the king said. He let the word hang in the air before continuing. "In the ancient mythology, the she-wolf Asena was the one who saved and guided the ancestors when they stood on the edge of extinction. She was the one who led them back to survival and gave rise to our people." The king slowly crossed his arms. That name did not appear by chance. In her family, it has passed from generation to generation, from grandmother to mother, and from mother to her. An ancient legacy, carried like a promise. Khan remained silent. "So look closely, my son," the king said at last. "Perhaps you did not choose merely a woman." He smiled slightly. "Perhaps you chose exactly the she-wolf you needed to rule beside you." The king looked at his son for another moment. "I am very proud of you." Khan did not answer. He simply stepped forward and embraced his father. The news reached the entire castle before midday. A wedding and a coronation on the same day. The prince would become king, and the woman he had brought from the wine house would become queen. The maids arrived in Asena's chambers, and the room that had been hers since arriving at the castle turned into something else entirely. Fabrics, jewels, combs, and skilled hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The dress was a deep blue, with embroidery that traced the neckline and sleeves like restrained flames. The jewels they placed around her neck had been once worn by King Avar. The desert of Cappadocia looked different that day. Torches, bonfires, tapestries laid across the ground. People, guards, counselors, servants, representatives from nearby villages, and at the back, standing in a semicircle, the elders of the pack. King Avar's eyes moved across the gathering with the calm of someone who had finally arrived at a moment long awaited. Khan stood beside his father. He wore ceremonial garments Asena had never seen him wear, dark fabrics with golden details, and there was something in that attire that made him at once the same man, and another version of him she was still learning to know. Upon his head rested the ceremonial royal turban, fastened by a crafted metal piece where something was meant to be placed at its center. His shoulders were firm, his jaw set with determination, and his eyes swept across the hall until they found her. And then they remained that way for a moment. Nothing else remained, only his eyes on hers, crossing the distance. Asena walked. She reached Khan's side, and he extended his hand, and she took it with the ease of someone who had done that for years. King Avar watched the two of them for a moment. Then he turned his gaze to everyone present, and the rough voice that had ruled Valkyria for decades sounded again, without losing any of the weight it had always carried. This kingdom was built upon difficult choices, he said, and the silence in the hall was absolute. Every stone cost something. Every generation that passed through here left a part of itself behind. He paused. Today I make the simplest choice since the day I sat upon the throne. All eyes turned toward Khan. My son, he said, with a voice that was both king and father. You are the man this kingdom needs. Not because you were born here, not because blood demands it, but because you chose the right path, even when it would have been easier not to. He paused again. And because you chose with your heart, not calculation. That is what makes you a king. Khan remained completely still. King Avar then removed the ruby from his ceremonial turban with both hands, slowly, with the care of someone placing down something he had carried for a very long time, and set it into the center of his son's turban. King Avar stepped back, and slightly bowed his head to his son. My king, he said. Khan stood motionless, feeling the weight of responsibility. Now the elder of the pack moved forward with the precision of someone who had performed that ritual through many moons. He stepped into the center of the semicircle with slow steps and stopped before Khan and Asena. The elder inclined his head slightly, as though confirming a truth he had long known. Then he drew from his robes a small blade, with a simple handle and no ornament. Right hand, he said to Khan. Khan extended his hand without hesitation. The blade passed across his palm in a quick, precise motion, leaving a thin line that slowly opened in red. He made no sound. He simply held his hand out, looking at the cut with the calm of someone who understands what he is doing. The elder turned to Asena. Right hand. She extended hers. The blade passed across it, and the pain was slight. Asena looked at the thin red line in her palm for a moment, feeling the warmth of the blood rising slowly. The elder put the blade away. Join your hands. Khan turned toward her. Asena lifted her eyes from the cut and met his. Their hands met. Their blood mingled along the line where their palms touched, warm and real. The elder placed his aged hands gently over theirs, covering the joined palms with a light touch that carried the weight of generations. And he spoke in a voice that filled the hall without effort. 2 lives, 1 destiny, the kingdom, the pack. Night arrived with the slow rhythm of ceremonial evenings, the kind that seem unwilling to end. Later in the castle hall, the banquet lasted for hours, with wine and food in abundance and conversations flowing. King Avar, now free of the crown's weight, though not of the presence it had left in him, sat beside her for a while and spoke of simple things. The garden, the herbs, the healer grew in the southern courtyard, a fountain he had ordered built when Khan was born. Khan stayed near her the entire night. The voices of the final guests faded through the corridors, and the torches were extinguished one by one. What neither of them knew was what was happening in the corridor outside. 3 counselors had remained after the others departed. They were the oldest among those who still served on the council after Demir's exile, men who had served the previous king and carried the memory of how things once were, with the stubbornness typical of those who do not easily trust the new. They had watched the ceremony with careful attention, weighing every detail, and the conclusion they reached, whispered between themselves in the corners of the banquet, was simple. It is a charade. He has never shown interest in a woman before, said the oldest of the 3, in a whisper that was no longer so quiet in that silent corridor. Just to satisfy the king before illness takes him for good. The other 2 nodded with the calm certainty of men who require little proof to confirm what they already believe. 1 night, said the second. We only need 1 night to hear something that proves it. And so they remained there, the 3 of them, leaning against the corridor wall in their ceremonial robes, waiting. The castle was quiet. The nearest torch cast a faint glow across the stone. Then the sounds began. They were not immediate. They came slowly. First a murmur, then low voices that arrived not as words but as tone. Then a dull thud against wood that made all 3 counselors straighten at the same time. Then another. Then came a sound that most certainly did not belong to 2 strangers sharing the same roof for mere political convenience. The oldest counselor stood with his mouth open. The second placed a hand against the wall, searching for balance. The third, who had been the most skeptical of them all, turned his face toward the corridor with an expression close to embarrassment. The sounds continued, with a regular rhythm that left no room for any other interpretation. The oldest counselor looked at the other 2. The other 2 looked back at him. In that dark corridor, on the night of a wedding and coronation, a silent and deeply awkward understanding settled between them. They had stayed where they should not have stayed to hear something they did not need to hear. The oldest was the first to step away. The other 2 followed with hurried steps that tried to sound dignified and did not entirely succeed. And the corridor was left empty. Inside the chamber, Asina lay on her back staring at the ceiling, her face warm from a combination of things she was not going to name out loud anytime soon. Khan lay beside her, his breathing still faster than usual. The silence lasted for a while, one neither of them felt the need to fill. I think the counselors heard, she said at last, in a voice attempting seriousness and failing. Khan remained quiet for a second. Then the sound that escaped his chest was unmistakably the beginning of laughter he was very clearly trying to suppress, and failing. Too bad for them, he said. Asena pressed her lips together. It lasted about 3 seconds before the 2 of them burst into laughter at the same time. A real laugh, the kind that does not ask permission. It echoed through the corridor now empty, where 3 counselors had stood not long before, and at that moment there was no one left to hear it. Khan moved toward her, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and kissed her neck. Come back. Dance for me. Asena laughed and turned to kiss him,